Imagine a time long ago, a time when Europe still wrote mostly on parchment, on vellum, on the stretched skins of animals. Imagine monks bent over their desks in dimly lit monasteries, copying lines of scripture letter by letter, hour by hour, each stroke of the quill scratching quietly in the silence of stone walls. For centuries, this was the sound of knowledge being preserved, the scratching of feather against skin, the scent of ink, the endless repetition of sacred words. And yet, far to the east, something different had already existed for centuries. Something softer, lighter, thinner than animal skin. Something that could be folded, stacked, sewn into books more easily than parchment. Something that had first been born in China, in the first centuries of the Common Era. Paper. A simple word, but a slow traveler. From China, paper traveled westward along the Silk Road. Caravan by caravan, step by step. Traders carried not only silk and spices, but also the knowledge of pulp and fiber. In Samarkand, in the 8th century, Arab scholars and artisans learned how to press plant fibers into sheets, and from Samarkand the craft spread into the heart of the Islamic world. Baghdad, Damascus, Cairo, the Arab world embraced paper, filled it with calligraphy, with mathematics, with philosophy, with the wisdom of ages past and ages present. But Europe was slower to accept it. In Europe, parchment was tradition. Parchment was strong, durable, respectable. The monks trusted it, the scribes trusted it, the rulers trusted it. Paper, by contrast, seemed fragile, foreign, uncertain, and so for centuries Europe hesitated. Yet the world changes, even when the old ways resist. Trade carried not only goods, but also ideas. In the 11th and 12th centuries, European merchants, especially in Italy and Spain, began to encounter paper more and more frequently. They saw it in the markets of Muslim Spain, in Toledo, in Valencia. They saw it in Amalfi, on the coast of Italy, where the sea carried knowledge as easily as it carried ships. They touched it, they bent it, they tested it, and slowly they began to accept it. Picture the first Europeans who held a sheet of paper in their hands. Imagine their fingers brushing across its surface, softer than skin, lighter than parchment, easier to fold, easier to cut, and above all, cheaper. One sheep might make only a few sheets of parchment, but paper could be made from rags, from old clothes, from the waste of households. It was not bound to the herds of animals. It was bound to human industry, to human habit, to the scraps of daily life. And so, slowly, quietly, paper entered the daily rhythms of medieval Europe. The first workshops. In the 12th century, the first true paper mills appeared in Europe. Amalfi in southern Italy is often mentioned. There, streams ran down from the hills, providing water to power wooden hammers that pounded cloth rags into pulp. The pulp was collected, stirred, and then lifted in wooden frames. The frames were dipped into the slurry, lifted carefully, shaken gently to even out the fibers, and then set aside to dry. Slowly a thin sheet would form, one sheet at a time, then another, then another. Day after day, hour after hour, workers repeated the same motions. Pound the rags, stir the pulp, dip the frame, lift the sheet, dry it on the walls of the mill. Over and over, the same rhythm, the same patience. A rhythm not unlike breathing. And in that repetition, Europe began to change. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but slowly, quietly, like the turning of a great wheel. Hesitations. Still, paper did not conquer easily. Many Europeans doubted it. Some said it would not last. Some said it was too weak for important documents. Kings and courts hesitated. Monks frowned. The church, so accustomed to vellum manuscripts that lasted centuries, doubted whether this new material could preserve the Holy Word. And yet, there was a need. The 12th and 13th centuries were times of growth, of trade, of cities expanding, of merchants writing contracts, of scholars filling libraries. Parchment was too slow, too expensive, too limited. Paper was faster. Paper was cheaper. Paper was good enough. And so, despite hesitation, it spread. The path through Spain. In Spain, under Islamic rule, Paper had already taken root. The great libraries of Cordova and Toledo were filled with paper manuscripts. When Christian kingdoms pushed southward, they inherited not only cities and lands, but also the craft of papermaking. From there, it traveled north, into France, into Germany, into England, each step slower than the last, each adoption cautious but inevitable. The scribes noticed, the merchants noticed, even the rulers noticed. For every hesitation, there was also curiosity. And curiosity is a door that rarely stays closed, a material of transition. Think of a monk in the 13th century. He sits at his desk with a sheet of parchment before him, and beside it, for the first time, a sheet of paper. He looks from one to the other. Parchment. Heavy, yellow, smooth. Paper. Light, white, slightly rough. He dips his quill, tests it. The ink spreads differently, soaking into the fibers instead of sitting on the surface. At first he frowns. At first he doubts, but then he writes again, and he realizes it works. Different, yes, but it works. And so, paper was written upon, slowly at first, reluctantly, but then more and more, until eventually the balance shifted. Why paper mattered? The story of paper in Europe is not dramatic. There are no great battles, no kings rising and falling, only fibers, rags, mills, sheets drying in the sun, only merchants and scribes, monks and students handling something new. And yet, within this quiet story lies a transformation as powerful as any war. For paper would become the foundation of books, of contracts, of letters, of knowledge itself. Without paper, Europe's later explosion of learning, the universities, the Renaissance, the printing press, would have been impossible. Paper was the silent stage upon which history would soon perform. But in the 12th century and the 13th, it was only beginning, a quiet beginning, a slow beginning. One sheet at a time. Repetition of the image. Think once more of the paper mill in Amalfi. The wheel turning, the hammers pounding, the pulp being stirred, the frame dipping, the sheet lifting, the water dripping, the sheet drying. Over and over, day after day, year after year. The sound of water, the sound of wood, the sound of hammers. Not exciting, not dramatic, but steady, and in that steadiness lay transformation. A pause. Let us pause here, let us breathe with the workers. Inhale with the lifting of the frame, exhale with the dripping of water. Inhale with the drying of the sheet, exhale with the turning of the wheel. The history of Europe in this moment is not a story of kings or battles. It is a story of fibers settling in water, of sheets drying on walls, of merchants testing a new material, of monks hesitating and then accepting. It is a story of patience. It is a story of transition. It is a story of paper. Closing of part 1. And so ends the first chapter of this tale. The arrival of paper in Europe. Not a shout, but a whisper. Not a battle, but a rhythm. Not a clash of swords, but the drip of water. The pounding of hammers. The slow drying of sheets. One sheet at a time. One breath at a time. One moment at a time. Sleep now, if you wish, for the story of paper has only begun. Amalfi and its cotton rag paper. In the hills of southern Italy, where streams ran swiftly toward the sea, Amalfi built some of Europe's first paper mills. The city was already known as a maritime power. Its merchants sailed to the east, to Byzantium, to North Africa. They carried spices, silk, and knowledge. And now, in the 12th century, they carried paper-making too. Imagine the scene. Wooden water wheels turning slowly in the current, their paddles splashing endlessly. The wheels powered hammers, heavy wooden mallets that rose and fell, crushing cloth rags into a wet, fibrous pulp. The sound was steady, rhythmic, like the heartbeat of the workshop. The workers of Amalfi gathered old linen, cotton rags, and cast-off cloth. Clothes no longer fit to wear became the raw material for something new. The rags were soaked, fermented, pounded until their fibers loosened and blended. The pulp that resulted was pale, soft, almost formless. Yet within it lay the possibility of sheets that could carry words, ideas, and memory. Step by step, the papermakers dipped wooden frames, called molds, into the slurry. Each mold was made of fine mesh stretched across a wooden frame. As the craftsman lifted the mold, water dripped away, leaving behind a thin mat of fibers. He shook the mold gently, side to side, to settle the fibers evenly. Then he laid the forming sheet carefully aside to dry. One worker, one mold, one vat of pulp, and from this, one sheet of paper at a time. Not dozens at once, not hundreds, only one, then another, a rhythm of patience. The texture of Amalfi paper. The Amalfi sheets were thick, sturdy, made mostly from cotton fibers. Cotton gave strength, resilience, and a softness under the hand. Compared with parchment, they were lighter, easier to fold, easier to bind into quires. Merchants of Amalfi admired the sheets, testing them with ink, watching as the fibers absorbed the lines. At first the ink spread unpredictably, but soon scribes learned how to adjust their strokes, how to guide the quill. Day after day, more sheets were hung to dry on the walls of the mills, rows upon rows, fluttering gently in the breeze. It was not a dramatic sight, not a heroic sight, but it was the birth of something steady, useful, enduring. Suspicion and acceptance. Even in Amalfi, some doubted. The church was slow to adopt the material. In monasteries, monks still clung to parchment, declaring that only animal skin could safeguard scripture. Yet merchants cared less for permanence and more for practicality. They needed contracts, bills of exchange, shipping records. Paper served them well, so while the monks hesitated, the merchants embraced it. Amalfi's workshops grew busier, more rags were gathered, more pulp was made, more sheets were hung. The rhythm of labor. Picture the workers again. Bare feet on wet stone floors, sleeves rolled up, hands deep in vats of pulp. They were not wealthy men, not scholars or kings, but through their steady labor they shaped the future. Hammer falls, water drips, fibers settle. Hammer falls, water drips, fibers settle. Over and over, day after day, the repetition almost like a chant, almost like prayer, though no words were spoken. And the sheets, when dried, stacked neatly, dozens, then hundreds, then thousands. The trade in paper. Amalfi's merchants carried these sheets on ships that sailed the Mediterranean, to Sicily, to Pisa, to Genoa. They traded not only goods but also possibilities. Paper became part of commerce, part of exchange, part of daily life. The merchants noticed its advantages. Where parchment required herds of sheep, paper required only rags, and rags were plentiful in every city. Old clothes, old linens, the cast-offs of daily life could be transformed into writing surfaces. Contracts could be written more quickly, ledgers could be filled more cheaply, letters could be sent more easily. Step by step, the rhythms of trade aligned with the rhythms of papermaking. The appearance of watermarks. In Amalfi, as in other paper towns, a small detail began to emerge. Papermakers pressed designs, called watermarks, into the wire mesh of their molds. When the sheet was held up to the light, a faint symbol appeared. At first, perhaps simple lines or circles. Later, lions, crosses, flowers, coats of arms. The watermark served as a signature of the mill, a silent mark of origin. For merchants, it guaranteed authenticity. For historians, centuries later, it became a clue to trace the journey of a single sheet. Resistance, beyond Amalfi. Yet beyond Amalfi, resistance lingered. In Paris, in London, in the royal chancelleries, parchment still dominated. Paper seemed untrustworthy for charters, laws, holy texts. But while the high offices resisted, the streets and markets welcomed it. Students at new universities, merchants in growing towns, travelers sending letters, these were the ones who embraced Amalfi paper. They cared less for tradition and more for access, for speed, for affordability. And so, even as kings hesitated, the people began to change. A world in transition. The 12th and 13th centuries were times of growth. Cities expanded, markets flourished, universities multiplied, and at the quiet center of this growth lay the humble sheet of Amalfi paper. Not celebrated, not exalted, not even noticed by many, but present, steady, accumulating in stacks that would carry Europe into a new age. One sheet, then another, one stack, then another, one shipload, then another. Not fast, not sudden, but unstoppable. So let us pause again and listen, not to the clash of armies, not to the proclamations of kings, but to the hum of the water wheel, the fall of wooden hammers, the dripping of water, the flutter of drying sheets. Amalfi's mills were not dramatic places, but they were steady places. And in their steadiness, they gave birth to something greater than any one man, any one city, any one time. The cotton rag paper of Amalfi was not a miracle. It was labor. It was patience. It was rhythm. And it was the quiet foundation of Europe's transformation. Troyes and the linen fibers of France. Far from Amalfi's cotton rags and Mediterranean mills, northern France found its own path to papermaking, through the fibers of linen. In the town of Toledo, nestled along the Seine, a different kind of workshop emerged. The climate was cooler, the rivers slower, the traditions older. And yet, here too, the rhythm of papermaking began to take root. The craftsmen of Troyes relied not on cotton, but on linen, discarded garments, worn shirts, old household cloth. Linen was abundant in northern Europe, woven in every town, used in every home. When these cloths reached the end of their life, they became the treasure of the papermakers. Picture the scene: workers cutting the linen into strips, soaking them in vats, waiting days for the fibers to loosen. The air smelled faintly sour, the scent of fermentation and waterlogged cloth. Yet to the papermakers, it was the scent of possibility. In dark workshops, wooden mallets rose and fell, breaking the linen into pulp. The sound echoed through the beams, steady, slow, unending. Hammer after hammer, blow after blow. And when the pulp was ready, the molds appeared. Frames dipped into cloudy vats, lifted carefully, dripping, trembling, while the papermaker's hands shook the fibers into place. Each sheet was pale, gray-white, slightly rough under the fingers. Unlike Amalfi's cotton, Troyes linen gave a different texture, strong, crisp, more resistant to tearing, for the work of patience. Day after day, the same rhythm continued. Dip the mold, lift the sheet, let the water drip, press the fibers, set them aside to dry. A work of patience, of repetition, of silence. The workers were anonymous, their names are forgotten, yet their hands created the sheets upon which merchants would write their contracts, upon which students would take notes, upon which letters would travel. In the markets of Troyes, merchants examined the new sheets with curiosity. They touched them, bent them, compared them to parchment. Some frowned, some nodded. Step by step, acceptance spread. The texture of linen paper. The linen sheets were heavier than cotton paper, and they bore the faint marks of the mesh upon which they had been formed. To scribes, these marks were at first distracting. To modern eyes, they are beautiful. When ink met linen paper, it sank quickly, biting into the fibers. The letters held firm, sharp, black. Merchants liked this. Contracts on linen paper appeared strong, clear, confident. Hesitations remain, but still doubt lingered. In monasteries, parchment ruled. The monks muttered that only vellum could preserve holy scripture. Kings feared that charters written on paper would not last. Scholars hesitated to trust their knowledge to a fragile new surface. And yet the need grew. The universities of Paris and Orleans demanded more materials, the fairs of Champagne produced endless contracts, the courts needed records. Slowly, reluctantly, the linen sheets of Troyes began to fill ledgers, letters, and libraries, watermarks of France. In Troyes, paper makers too began to experiment with watermarks. The cross was common, a symbol of faith and authenticity, sometimes a flower, sometimes a simple geometric design. Each watermark was a quiet signature, invisible unless held to the light. The sheets dried in long rows, sunlight falling upon them, faint patterns glowing in their hearts. They spread northward. From Troyes, the craft spread northward, into Paris, where students copied Aristotle on linen sheets, into Flanders, where merchants tallied their wool trades, into Germany, where scholars began to notice the new material. Ships carried bales of linen paper along the Seine, down to Rouen, across the Channel to England. Step by step, river by river, paper's quiet conquest advanced. Parchment versus linen. The debate continued. In royal courts, scribes still preferred vellum for charters. Parchment was heavy, venerable, respectable. Paper was still considered light, common, perhaps unworthy. But in the markets, in fairs, in the universities and counting houses, the story was different. There, paper was already winning. Not loudly, not dramatically, but inevitably. The quiet transformation. Think again of the workers in Troyes, their feet wet on stone floors, their hands raw from pulp, their bodies weary from lifting and pressing. They did not know they were shaping history. They only knew they were making sheets. Sheet after sheet, stack after stack, day after day. And those stacks, once sold, once filled with ink, became part of Europe's memory. So let us end this chapter as we began, with the rhythm of hammers, the dripping of water, the drying of sheets. In Troyes, in northern France, linen became the path to paper. It was not sudden, it was not dramatic, but it was steady. And in that steadiness, Europe's transformation continued. One hammer fall, one dripping frame, one drying sheet at a time. Spain and the Arab influence. In Spain, under the rule of the Moors, paper was not foreign. It was familiar. It was already trusted. It was already used. Long before Northern Europe hesitated, southern Spain had embraced the sheets of fiber that came from the east. Córdoba, Toledo, Valencia, all became gateways, places where knowledge and material passed between cultures. The great libraries of Al-Andalus glittered with manuscripts, many of them written on paper. Scholars copied Greek philosophy, translated into Arabic, works of mathematics, medicine, astronomy. The material was light, plentiful, and already woven into the intellectual life of the Iberian Peninsula. Imagine Córdoba in the 10th and 11th centuries, its streets alive with scholars, its shelves filled with thousands upon thousands of manuscripts, most of them not on parchment but on paper. Where the north still clung to animal skins, the south had already moved on. In the workshops of Valencia and Toledo, by the 12th century, Valencia had become one of the most important centers of papermaking in Europe. Its climate, warm and dry, suited the drawing of sheets. Its rivers provided power for mills. Its artisans, drawing on centuries of Islamic tradition, perfected the craft. Picture the scene inside a Valencian workshop. Vats filled with slurry, molds dipped carefully, workers stacking sheet after sheet to press and dry. The rhythm was no different from Amalfi or from Samarkand before it, yet the paper here had its own character. It was thinner, smoother, easier to write upon, but also more fragile. When merchants unrolled contracts written on Valencian paper, they noticed the difference. The sheets were flexible, but they tore more easily. The ink sat clearly, but the edges frayed. In Toledo, too, the craft flourished. The city, with its mixture of Christian, Muslim, and Jewish cultures, became a crossroads of technique. Scribes copied religious texts, legal documents, and scientific treatises onto paper that came directly from its mills. The character of Spanish paper. Unlike Amalfi's cotton rag paper, Spanish paper often combined fibers in different ways. Linen and hemp joined cotton. Sometimes the mixtures varied by availability, by trade, by season. Each sheet carried the signature of its place and its moment. Some sheets were thin and nearly translucent, others heavier and more opaque. Merchants noticed the inconsistency. Scholars, however, cared less about perfection. They cared about abundance. With paper, manuscripts multiplied. Rows of sheets hung in the dry air, fluttering in the Spanish sun. The walls of workshops glowed with pale white, with the promise of words yet unwritten. A bridge between worlds. Paper in Spain was more than a material. It was a bridge between cultures. The Arabs brought the craft from the East. The Christians, through conquest, inherited it. The Jews, as traders and scholars, helped spread it. Each culture left its mark. Watermarks reflected symbols from every tradition, crescents, crosses, geometric patterns. Each page, silently, carried the story of encounter, of exchange, of coexistence. In Toledo's streets, a Muslim scholar might copy verses of philosophy on paper. A Jewish merchant might sign a contract on another. A Christian scribe might prepare a charter on a third. All three touched the same material, though their worlds were different. The flow of knowledge. With paper, books multiplied. With books, knowledge flowed. Universities rising in Northern Europe hungered for texts. Spain provided. Manuscripts of Aristotle, Galen, Euclid, translated into Latin from Arabic, copied onto paper, moved northward through trade and scholarship. Students in Paris read words that had once been preserved in Baghdad, copied in Toledo, carried on Valencian paper. The material, humble and silent, was the vessel of civilization speaking to each other. The trade routes. From Valencia and Toledo, bales of paper traveled on carts, on mule trains down to the ports of the Mediterranean. Ships carried them across the sea to Marseille, to Genoa, to Pisa. From there, they spread further north. Imagine the docks. Crates of spices, rolls of silk, sacks of grain, and stacks of paper sheets, bound in bundles, wrapped for travel. Paper became another commodity, traded like cloth, like wine, like wool. Merchants weighed its price, counted its sheets, stacked it carefully in storerooms. They saw its worth not as art, but as necessity. The resistance weakens. The more paper spread, the harder it became for Northern Europe to resist. Kings might still doubt, monks might still cling to parchment, but merchants and scholars were already moving forward. A Parisian student writing lecture notes on paper did not care whether parchment lasted longer. He cared that he could afford 10 sheets instead of 1. A merchant in Flanders did not care whether a contract would endure centuries. He cared that he could keep his accounts quickly, cheaply, abundantly. Step by step, Spanish paper eroded the old certainty of vellum, the quiet transformation. Think again of the Valencian workshop, the dripping of frames, the fluttering of sheets, the soft light of the Spanish sun. Nothing loud, nothing dramatic, only patience, repetition, silence. And yet, from those walls of drying paper came a transformation that would shape centuries. The parchment world was fading, the paper world was rising, not in a shout, but in a whisper. So let us end this chapter in the same way, with the sound of water dripping, with the sight of paper sheets fluttering, with the silence of workers repeating the same motions again and again. Valencia, Toledo, Cordoba, these were the bridges. Through them, paper entered Europe not as a stranger, but as a companion. And in their steady rhythm, Europe found a new material for memory, a new surface for thought, a new foundation for the future. One sheet at a time, one bale at a time, one journey at a time, paper sizes, measurements, and the boring but soothing details. By the 14th century, paper was no longer a curiosity. It was no longer only the material of merchants, of students, of cautious scribes. It had become common, and with commonness came the need for order. Paper could not remain irregular forever. Merchants wanted contracts of similar size, universities wanted notebooks that stacked evenly, courts wanted charters that could be stored neatly, and so, slowly, Europe began to speak of measurement. The names of the sizes were many: royal, folio, quarto, octavo, names that sound simple, perhaps even elegant, yet behind each name lay careful dimensions, in inches, in centimeters, in ratios. Royal paper was one of the most widely recognized. In many regions, it measured about 20 inches by 15 inches, roughly 50 by 38 centimeters. But not always. In France, royal might be slightly larger. In England, slightly smaller. In Germany, different again. Imagine a papermaker lifting a mold meant for royal sheets, wide, heavy, filled with pulp. The sheet that emerged was broad, impressive, suited for important documents, charters, proclamations, university volumes. All could be written upon royal sheets. And yet, even royal was not fixed. It shifted from town to town, from century to century, sometimes 42 by 29 centimeters, sometimes 48 by 31, sometimes more, sometimes less. Always royal, yet never quite the same. Folio. Folio was another standard. Though standard meant little in the Middle Ages, a folio sheet might measure 33 by 20 centimeters, or 35 by 22, or 31 by 19. Always close, never identical. The name itself meant leaf, for a folio was a single folded sheet, creating 2 leaves, 4 pages. Imagine a student in Paris holding a folio notebook, copying lectures, the quill scratching on each side of the folded sheet. Folio was smaller than royal, yet still substantial, large enough for records, portable enough for use in study, neither too large nor too small, neither too costly nor too fragile. Folio was the balance point. Quarto. Quarto was smaller still, a sheet folded twice, producing 4 leaves, 8 pages, about 24 by 15 centimeters, though once again the exact size depended on where and when. A quarto volume might be a small handbook, a pocket-sized text, something a scholar could carry on the road, not as grand as a royal, not as common as a folio, but useful in its way. And the numbers went further: octavo, sexto, duodecimo, each folding creating smaller leaves, more pages, more compact books. The repetition of ratios. The rhythm of these names was like the rhythm of the mills. Royal, folio, quarto, octavo. Royal, folio, quarto, octavo. Over and over, large, medium, small, smaller. Each size with its own place, each size with its own use, each size with its own tradition. Scholars filled folios, kings signed charters on royals. Travelers carried quartos, students carried octavos. The variety of paper sizes became a quiet order in a noisy age. Measurements and detail. To speak of paper is to speak of numbers. 42 by 29, 33 by 20, 24 by 15. Imagine hearing those numbers again and again until they blur into rhythm, into calm. 42 by 29, 33 by 20. 24 by 15, royal, folio, quarto. The numbers repeat, the names repeat, the order repeats. Storage and stacks. Merchants cared not only about writing, but about storing. A stack of royal sheets took more space, weighed more. A stack of folios fit neatly into boxes. A stack of quartos could be tied with string, carried by hand. Picture a storeroom. Piles of paper stacked by size, each bundle labeled in charcoal. Royal here, folio there, quarto in the corner. Workers counted them carefully, 1 sheet at a time. The counting itself was soothing, repetitive. 1, 2, 3, up to 100. Bundle tied. And then again, the monotony of precision. Even watermarks reflected size. A royal watermark looked different from a quarto watermark. The frames themselves varied, and so the marks did too. Scribes debated endlessly. Was this sheet royal or was it too small? Was this folio or was it too wide? The debates were long, repetitive, sometimes pointless. Yet in that repetition lay order. A king's charter must be on royal, a merchant's account could be on folio, a handbook could be on quarto. And so rules emerged, rules that no one enforced, yet everyone followed. Why sizes mattered? Sizes mattered because memory mattered. A document too small looked unworthy, a book too large was difficult to carry, a sheet too thin might not last, a sheet too thick wasted fibers. Royal for permanence, folio for balance, quarto for utility. Over and over, the choice repeated. Over and over, the scribes decided. So let us close this chapter in numbers, in names, in repetitions. Royal folio quarto octavo, 42 by 29, 33 by 20, 24 by 15. Not dramatic, not loud, not heroic, but steady, predictable, endlessly repeating, like the dripping of water, like the pounding of hammers, like the drying of sheets. The sizes of paper were not thrilling, but they were necessary, and in their quiet order, they lulled Europe into a new age of writing. One royal at a time, one folio at a time, one quarto at a time. Watermarks and their hidden language. When papermakers lifted their molds from the vats, something more than fibers settled into the sheets, something invisible at first glance, visible only when held to the light. The watermark. It began as an accident, or perhaps as an experiment. A papermaker bent wire into a simple shape, a circle, a cross, and fixed it onto the mesh of his mold. When pulp settled, the fibers lay thinner where the wire pressed, and so when the sheet dried, that symbol remained, faint, ghostly, hidden, until lifted to the sun. The earliest watermarks were simple. Circles, crosses, straight lines. Nothing ornate, nothing decorative. Only marks. And yet, even in their simplicity, they mattered. They said, this sheet was made here. This sheet is ours. This is our work. The identity of a sheet. In Italy, lions became common. The lion of St. Mark in Venice appeared often, silent guardian of a page. In France, crosses multiplied. In Germany, flowers unfolded in fibers. Each watermark was a signature, a silent declaration of origin. A sheet without a mark might be doubted, might be dismissed. A sheet with a mark could be trusted, could be valued. Imagine a merchant holding a bundle of sheets, lifting one toward the sun, watching faint lines emerge. There it was, the lion, the cross, the flower. Proof that the sheet came from a known mill, from a trusted hand. The language of symbols. Over time, the watermarks grew more elaborate. Shields, coats of arms, letters, even animals appeared. A star might mean one mill, a bull's head another, a pair of scissors yet another. Some marks were religious, crosses, chalices, saints. Some were secular, tools, animals, initials. Each spoke in silence. Each carried meaning without words. To the papermaker, the mark was identity. To the merchant, the mark was guarantee. To the scholar, centuries later, the mark was history. Patterns of repetition. Watermarks repeated again and again, sheet after sheet, bundle after bundle. 100 sheets with the same cross, 1,000 with the same bull's head. The repetition was soothing, predictable, steady. And yet, within the repetition, variation appeared. The line bent slightly, the wire pressed unevenly, the fibers lay differently. No two watermarks were ever exactly the same, each sheet unique, yet all part of a family. This endless dance between sameness and difference gave watermarks their quiet fascination. The merchant's eye. Merchants learned to read watermarks as they read contracts. A sheet with a known mark sold more quickly, carried more weight. A sheet with an unknown mark might be refused. Picture a marketplace in Paris. Bundles of paper unwrapped, sunlight falling across them, merchants lifting sheet after sheet to the light. One sheet showed a cross, accepted. Another, a circle, accepted. A third, nothing, set aside, perhaps rejected. Watermarks became currency, silent signs of trust in trade. The scholar's clue. Centuries later, historians and bibliographers learned to read watermarks as clues. By studying them, they traced where a manuscript was copied, where a letter was written, where a book was bound. The faint lion on a sheet might prove it came from Venice. The bull's head might prove it was German. The flower might prove it was French. Each symbol, once invisible, became a voice across centuries. The library of manuscripts became a map of watermarks, each pointing to a mill, each pointing to a time. The hidden beauty. Watermarks were not made to be beautiful, yet they became beautiful. Their faint lines, their delicate patterns, their ghostly appearance in light, all gave them an elegance parchment never knew. Imagine holding a medieval sheet to the sun, the surface plain, the texture rough, but within it a hidden symbol glowing softly, a secret revealed only when sought. The beauty lay not in brightness, but in subtlety, not in loudness, but in quiet, not in decoration, but in presence. The ritual of inspection. In workshops, papermakers inspected their sheets by lifting them one by one, each sheet against the sun, each mark revealed. The repetition was endless. Lift, inspect, stack. Lift, inspect, stack. Lift, inspect, stack. In storerooms, merchants repeated the same ritual. In libraries, scribes did too. Across centuries, the act remained unchanged. Lift the sheet. Let the light reveal its hidden voice, the symbol of trust. For rulers, watermarks offered more than beauty. They offered trust. A royal decree written on marked paper was harder to forge. A contract written on marked paper was harder to dispute. The watermark became a silent witness, present but unspoken. Not written in ink, not signed by hand, but impressed within the very fibers, invisible in shadow, visible in light, like truth itself. So let us end this chapter with the faint glow of watermarks, lions, crosses, flowers, stars, symbols pressed in wire, carried in fibers, revealed in sunlight. They were not loud, they were not dramatic, they were steady, repetitive, invisible until seen. And in their hidden language, you're found both trust and identity, one sheet at a time, one mark at a time, one faint glow at a time. The silent story of paper in daily life. By the late Middle Ages, paper was no longer strange, it was no longer fragile, it was no longer the newcomer. It had become part of life. Quietly, steadily, without triumph or fanfare, it entered the rhythm of Europe's days. In monasteries, where once only vellum ruled, paper began to appear beside the parchment, not for the grand illuminated Bibles, not for the holiest of books, but for notes, for drafts, for commentaries. Picture a monk at his desk, parchment open before him, but beside it sheets of paper filled with scribbled corrections, quick sketches, marginal notes. The heavy skin carried the eternal word. The lighter paper carried the thoughts of men. Day after day, monks filled these sheets with prayers, with sermons, with small observations. Paper allowed them to write more freely, more quickly, more abundantly. And so, within stone walls built for silence, paper became a silent companion. In courts, in royal courts, charters were still signed on vellum, but behind them, clerks kept their drafts on paper. A king might never see it, a noble might never touch it, but every decree, every proclamation, every law first passed across paper. Imagine a royal scribe, dipping his quill, drafting lines on paper sheets, crossing them out, beginning again, until the words were ready for vellum. The paper bore the uncertainty, the vellum bore the certainty. Paper became the rehearsal, parchment the performance. In markets. In the bustling markets, merchants no longer thought of paper as exotic. They thought of it as useful, contracts written quickly, ledgers filled daily, accounts tallied by night. Picture a merchant in Bruges counting coins, writing numbers in a paper ledger, turning page after page as the day went on. The book was not beautiful, not decorated, not illuminated, but it was full. Full of trades, full of wool, full of numbers. Paper became the servant of trade, quiet, reliable, always waiting to be filled. In universities, students carried stacks of paper folded into quires, tied with string, filled with hurried notes. A professor lectured, his words flowing and quills scratched quickly across paper. Some words were missed, some lines unfinished, but paper allowed the students to keep up, to write more than parchment ever would have allowed. Libraries filled with paper manuscripts, copies upon copies, multiplying knowledge. Aristotle in Latin, Galen in medicine, Euclid in geometry, texts once rare, now copied in abundance. The abundance was not perfection, but it was plenty. Even in homes, paper began to appear. Letters written between families, prayers copied for private devotion, accounts kept for households. Picture a woman by a small window, writing a letter to her husband away at war, her quill trembling, her words uneven, but her sheet of paper carrying them nonetheless. Picture a father teaching his child to write letters on scrap sheets of paper, ink blotting, lines uneven, yet words forming. Paper became part of memory, part of affection, part of everyday life. The rhythm of silence. Everywhere paper worked silently. It did not demand attention. It did not shine with gold. It did not glow like vellum illuminated with colors. It lay quietly, waiting for ink. The ink came slowly, quickly, carefully, hastily. It mattered little. Paper accepted all. Contracts, prayers, notes, poems, lists, records, all entered its fibers. All remained. The whisper of permanence. And yet, though paper seemed fragile, it endured. Sheets from Valencia, from Amalfi, from Troyes still exist today, centuries later. The monk's drafts, the merchant's ledgers, the student's notes, all survive, yellowed but legible. The whisper of permanence proved stronger than the doubt of fragility. So let us close, not with numbers, not with measurements, not with symbols, but with silence, the silence of paper in daily life. It was there in the monastery cell. It was there in the royal court. It was there in the market stall. It was there in the university hall. It was there in the home by the window. One sheet at a time, paper became part of Europe's breath. Not dramatic, not heroic, not loud, but steady, but constant, but patient. The silent language of paper was not written in ink. It was written in use. And that language endured.